All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Isabelle Meunier. It's July 18th, 2022. We're at Lavinea Wines in Carlton. Isabelle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
First question to get you started is why wine?
Why wine? Oh my gosh. I don't come from a wine drinking family whatsoever. I grew up in Quebec. I'm French Canadian, and my father was a high school teacher. My mother was a stay-at-home mom. They didn't drink at all. If we had a bottle of wine at Christmas, that was about it in our house when I was growing up. I would say that it was, when I was growing up, I had a huge love for food. Mm-hmm. And it's amazing that I'm not 300 pounds today because I enjoyed very much. I used to think when I was a young child that it would be terrible if I lost my sense of taste, mm-hmm. whereas some people think they don't want to get blind or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And that turned me into my undergraduate degree, which was I did hospitality, hotel and restaurant management to begin with. My first job was working in the kitchen, cooking foods. And ultimately, when I did that degree, I had to take a sommelier class as part of my degree. And that definitely, as a 19-year-old person, opened me up to the world of wine. And I found it fascinating because it was so foreign to me. I was in Montreal at that point. We start drinking young there. We are allowed to. It's not 21 there. And it's also what paved the path for my Pinot Noir journey, because the teacher for my sommelier class, as we were learning the wines of the world, at some point we got to the chapter of Burgundy and Pinot Noir, and he started talking about how it's the most finicky grapes that one can handle, that how challenging it is because it is so thin-skinned. And at the same time, during the tasting aspect of the class, when we started tasting all these Pinot Noirs, I had this revelation of, this is amazing because I have never seen so many differences in the wine. It's very light, I can see through the wine, but the flavors that I get are so different from one wine to the next. That is, I guess I was into the challenge. I wanted to figure out the challenge. But I was in Montreal, I had no clue, to me that seemed foreign to me, learning how to make wine. There's no vineyards of consequences in Quebec at the time. One thing led to another. After I graduated, I started a career in hospitality. I worked for very high-end hotel and restaurants, Relais Chateau type properties, 4 stars, 4 diamond properties, and I focused that first career in the front end of high-end dining rooms. And the part of my job that I loved the most was creating the wine lists for these restaurants, but also guiding customers to food and wine pairing. Like when they didn't know what to order with their meal, it felt very gratifying to be able to recommend something based on their likes and dislikes and see them have a great evening of their own. Later, I've got tired of working in the wine in the restaurant industry. I got tired of the late nights, of you work during all the holidays, Christmas, New Year's, when everyone's having a good time. So in my mid-20s, I was already looking for what else I could do. And because the last Relais Chateau I worked at and that I opened was focusing on, it was on Vancouver Island. It was focusing on BC wines only, and there was a guiding company that came through called Butterfield and Robinson, and they do cycling trips and hiking trips throughout the world. And I realized that I was looking for what else I could do. I didn't know what else I wanted to do. And through that, I saw an opportunity that I could move to France and be hired as a guide to lead cycling trips in the various regions of France, and considering I spoke French. And so I decided to stop my hospitality and to go guide in France for a couple of years until I could figure out what's next. And they loved the fact that I spoke French and that I had wine knowledge, so they put me as a guide on wine-specific trips. So I became one of their guides for their Burgundy trips, for their trips in Alsace, for some trips in the Loire, not very many. And then one particular trip was a Bordeaux to Burgundy trip that has 4 days in Bordeaux, private plane to Lyon, and then 4 days in Burgundy. It's an 8-day trip. So I was, and then there's a lot of wine tastings throughout, etc. So during those 2 years working for Butterfield & Robinson, their headquarters is in Beaune, in Burgundy. And that means that every time you come back from a trip, you check in with the main office, and then you check out your next trip and you go on the road. And during those 2 days, you're in Beaune, you're in the center of Burgundy. And so I met some local people there, I met some wonderful people there, and a friend of mine was looking into schools, and her and I started talking about. That's when it became possible. That's when, from the small person from Quebec, started thinking, I can stay here, I can go to school, I can learn how to make wine, I'm already here. So that's what I did. And I enrolled in a postgraduate degree, because I already had a degree, at the University of Dijon. And because at the time I knew I loved wine. I knew I loved Pinot in particular, but I didn't know which aspect exactly I loved. So the first postgraduate degree that I did was viticulture, enology, and international commerce of wine. So it had a 50-50 marketing aspect and a 50-50 viticulture and enology, because I needed to figure out, I didn't know which one I liked the most. So I needed to figure that out. And through my first year there, it became very clear to me that the technical lessons about viticulture and enology I was totally into, and the marketing and commerce ones, not so much. So as part of the postgraduate, we had a 6 months internship to do, and we had to write a thesis. And so I ended up telling most people were doing that on the marketing side, and I ended up telling my course directors, look, I appreciate the marketing side. I can write a thesis on the marketing side, but my internship I would like to do on the production side. Will you okay that? And at the time, I thought that I would come back to Canada and work in the wine industry somewhere in Canada. So I got an internship to work at a small winery on Vancouver Island called Ventry Schultz Winery. And Ventry Schultz was family owned. It was a married couple. He was from Moderna in Italy, and she was from Australia. And the winery that they started, they did wine as well as traditional balsamic vinegar. And I went to work with them for the 6 months. And at the time they were doubling the amount of land that they were planting. So part of the thesis was how to forecast the production and where we're going to sell, figure out the sales channels, and how to make the marketing plan for them, basically, based on that growth. And in the meantime, I learned a lot working in their vineyard and in their winery. And I learned a lot, but at the same time, I realized that when I was working there, they kept asking me questions because I had just come from Burgundy, from France. and I had just studied there. They were asking me questions as they were planting all their land that I could not answer, such as, here are our soils analysis. What varietals should we plant here? What density should we plant at? What rootstock scion combo is the best? And I realized that the program I'd done in France was wonderful, but it had not prepared me to work in the New World, because you don't make those decisions in Burgundy. You only plant Pinot or Chardonnay. You only plant at 10,000 plants per hectare. So there's a lot of, you don't decide to irrigate or not, you just cannot irrigate. So I realized during that internship that if I was going to make a difference in the New World, which is probably where I was going to end up, I needed more training. So I enrolled for another postgraduate in New Zealand, and I went to Lincoln University to do that. With regards to said thesis, technically I needed to present my thesis. I needed to go back to France to present my thesis. And my course directors said, you know, we take a field trip to California every year, so instead of making you fly back here, why don't you present your thesis at UC Davis in front of a mixture of professors from there and us, and as well as in front of the new group of class, so that they can see what that's like, what it's like to do this sort of thing. So I accepted, because it was much easier for me to fly down to Sacramento and do the presentation on my way to New Zealand than it was to fly back to France. So I ended up at Lincoln University. The reason for that choice had a lot to do with cool climate, had a lot to do with Pinot Noir that I wanted to learn, and I also wanted like the New World perspective, more of the science and how to understand and how to be able to make the best choices when there are these choices to make. In New Zealand, I met my husband because we were in the same class. And what else did I do? It was a one-year program. Then I started working in New Zealand. After I finished, I worked for a winery called Felton Road. I think one thing of importance that I would say is that I did not like the New World aspect of wanting to choose between viticulture and winemaking. So I really felt that it was hand in hand, and that probably because I started in Burgundy, that the people there, they're vignerons. They farm the land so that they can make wine, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to learn every aspect. I wanted to know that if I can do things well in a vineyard, then I know how to handle what comes to the winery, and I have the best chances of making great wine. So in New Zealand, so throughout my work experiences, I've always very carefully made sure that I could work in the vineyards as well as in the winery, and that it was a complete internship. I will come to you in the spring, I will work in the field the entire season, and then we're going to go in a winery, and I will make the wines in the winery. So that's what I did at Felton Road. I worked at Saracen Estate in New Zealand, and at some point I told my husband, we were dating at the time, I said, I love you very much, but now that I've seen the New World and the science, I need to go back to the old world. Because now I'm starting to be a little too, I don't want to lose the natural approach, and now I'm starting to be a little too concerned about bugs and how things can go wrong. And I said, I need to go back to the holistic approach that Burgundy has to offer. So we split for temporarily. He stayed in New Zealand, and I went back to Burgundy. And that's when I had my first mentorship, I would say, because I worked there for a domain called Domaine de la Vougerie. At the time, it had just been created, And the winemaker there was also French Canadian, but had been living in Burgundy for a really long time. His name is Pascal Marchand. And he been making wine in Pommard, for Contarmant, for many, many years. And then he was in charge of this new project. And I like to think that he probably agreed for me to go to work with him because I pestered him enough, A, and B, because I was also French Canadian, so he kind of wanted to help me out, another French Canadian making wine somewhere else. So I went back to Burgundy, worked at Domaine de la Vougerie, and that was owned by the Boisset family. And at the time, they were creating a joint venture in Canada called Clos Jourdain with Vincor Canada. So ultimately, they asked, long story short, Pascal felt, after I worked at the Domaine de la Vougerie, Pascal asked me if I would be willing to go back to Canada to work for the Clos Jourdain project, which I accepted. And then at that point, I asked my husband, will you please join me? I have this great work opportunity, in Canada for a handful of years. This is a brand new project. They have grand plans of building a multi-million-dollar building designed by Frank Gehry. They have all kinds of, so so he agreed, and he joined me in Canada, and I started the Clos Jourdain project for 2 years.
What year was that?
That was 2004 and 2000. Actually, I moved there in 2004, and I didn't move here till 2007. Mm-hmm. So from 04 to 07. At some point, when I was at the Clos Jourdain, and it was everything I wanted because it had 4 estates vineyard. It was growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay only. They were farming organically because of the joint venture between Boisset and Vincor Canada. It was well funded, and Pascal Marchand was the consultant on the project, so I could still continue to learn from him. Mm-hmm. But it turned out that my husband wasn't very happy in Niagara with the snow and the area. So after about 2 or 3 years, we decided as a couple to move to Oregon. So I remember vividly telling Pascal at Clos Jourdain that we had made a personal decision to move to Oregon. My husband had gotten a great opportunity as head winemaker for Argyle, so it was my turn to sort of follow and find what I could do here.
Okay, so we'll pick up the Oregon part in a second. I want to go back for a moment. It's a very interesting path, and you mentioned the kind of the balance of the new world, old world, and kind of going back and forth between. So tell me about, while you're doing that, you're being formally educated, you're also working in all these different places. Tell me about sort of starting to develop your winemaking knowledge and winemaking style. And at what point did you start to kind of become conscious of, I want to make this kind of wine, or I want to do it this kind of way?
I think it was throughout my path. I think my path was relatively unique in the fact that I flipped back and forward between the two a couple of times. But at the same time, the Burgundy side was the foundation of where I started, and that was when the sponge started taking in everything. And so from the cycling days, when I was cycling around and going wine tasting in those cellars, the people I met and the wines that I tasted through that, some of them were very magical to me, and the ones that were the most magical were the ones that were more natural, organic, biodynamics. So throughout those years, even before I started going to school, I quickly learned that, yes, I like the challenge that Pinot Noir can provide with its thin skin and finickiness, B, I like the natural approach. So I really need to know and learn how to do it in a natural way. I could also tell that at the time that some of the so-called natural wines could be faulty, you know, not necessarily be good. So I put it upon myself as a challenge to make sure that I was like, I know there's a way to do this so that it can taste. It doesn't need to be faulty because you're natural. I'm sure there's a way to do this, that you can make natural wines and have it elegant, beautiful, and complex and like a sound commercial wine too, not just a natural wine. So that's the quest that I started putting myself on over time, and that's what made the choices of going to Felton Road. I had a series of mentors, I think, in my career. So that started the quest of going to Felton, seeking the places that could teach me organic, biodynamics, viticulture, and winemaking in a good way that was natural, yet that would be able to be high quality too at the same time. Did I answer your question? Good.
When it comes to you mentioned the viticulture being such an important part as well. I'm curious about the viticulture education you were getting, and what point did you feel sort of confident in that part of things, in understanding viticulture and in kind of pushing the vines pushing the viticulture style to where you wanted it to be?
That's built up over time. I think that my first, like I said, my first job on Vancouver Island at Ventry Schultz, they put me in a vineyard, and they were self-taught. So it was the first time they had someone that had been with them that had education, proper. So they challenged and asked me a ton of questions on the viticultural side that I could not answer all of it, but that really started the huge interest. Then when I pursued in New Zealand, the classes were much more in depth. So then I started to very much better understand the viticultural side of things. Then when I went to Felton Road, they put me in the vineyards, and I was telling them that I wanted to learn and the vineyard manager kind of took me under his wing and started teaching me how they were planting and all kinds of things. So that built up over time. When I went back to France, I told Pascal, because he was farming, they were farming in-house, but only their Grand Cru vineyards were farming biodynamically. And I asked specifically, I want to learn your biodynamics. And so he put me on a team in Chambord-Musigny that has, on the team in Chambord-Musigny that has the most Grand Cru, so that I could do all of the BD, the biodynamic stuff as well in the vineyards. When Pascal recommended me to go over to the Clos Jourdain, the Clos Jourdain was designed, although it was in Niagara, it wasn't a winemaker's job, it was a vineyard manager and winemaker's job. So we had to farm our vineyards. That's when I became responsible for the farming of those vineyards. And in Niagara, it's incredibly challenging because it's really humid. So farming organically in Niagara, with that type of weather, you become very in tune. You become an expert at pest and disease management and what you can do with it, because you get everything under the sun. When I first moved to Oregon, just a big thing, I frustrated some people around because I was like, it's so easy farming here. Because to me, coming from Niagara, it felt easy. You have powdery mildew, but there's not too much else as far as disease pressure is concerned. I mean, the last couple of years have been different, but...
Spoke too soon.
Yes, I spoke too soon, exactly.
Before coming here, what were your impressions of Oregon's wine and Oregon's wine industry?
Before coming here, the last restaurant that I opened before I got into wine, had a West Coast only wine list with lots of wines from British Columbia, because that's where we were, but also Washington, Oregon, and California. And because I was Pinot-centric, I got a lot of Pinots from, at the time, Ken Wright's and Domaine in Oregon, and these labels coming in onto our wine list. And my impression of the Oregon wine industry was that it was burgeoning, it was new, but it had a tremendous amount of potential.
How did it compare? How did the wines compare to those in the places you'd been?
I found them, I think that the three best areas that I loved the Pinots from were New Zealand, Oregon, and Burgundy. In Niagara and in the Okanagan Valley, they each have their own set of challenges that I don't think are quite performing quite as well. And when I was trying to, I think as a winemaker, you end up choosing where to live based on your passion. So when my husband and I were having these discussions, we seriously considered staying in New Zealand, but it was too far from the rest of the world. And we made Oregon our home in huge part because it had all those things. The wines, to me, I felt very strongly that they could deliver as well as Burgundy. And I wanted to be a part of that.
So tell us about, once you got here in 2007, what was the first thing that you did? What was your kind of initial role here?
So that's a good question. I'm going to pick up where I left. When I told Pascal that I was decided to move to Oregon, he was somewhat disappointed, and he also rained on my picnic a little bit because I was telling him that that we had made the decision to move to Oregon, and that I thought there was a ton of potential, as we just discussed, and this was 15 years ago or more, but there was lots of potential and within the valley, and that I felt that I could, make a mark within Oregon and help the wine industry develop. And Pascal just kind of rained on my picnic and said, Isabelle, they've been making wine there for 20 years. There's a lot of talent there. Louisa Ponzi, blah, blah, blah. He says, and the wines are, So he said, I don't really think they have the terroir. And that kind of gave me, again, I guess I love challenges. That also gave me the, I'm going to prove you wrong sort of thing. But anyway, he took it in stride. He was happy that that's where we wanted to move. And long story short, he, at the same time, there was, Evening Land was starting in Oregon, a brand new project called Evening Land Vineyards. And the owner from New York, Mark Tarlov, was in talks with Dominique Lafont in Burgundy to be consultant on that project. And Dominique was really interested for the first time to do something outside of Burgundy and come and consult. And so Mark, the owner, told him, well, you got to find a winemaker. And at some point in Burgundy, it's not what you know, sometimes it's who you know. At some point in Burgundy, at the Saturday morning market in Beaune, Dominique bumped into Pascal. So Dominique asked Pascal Marchand, hey, I know you do consulting around the world. I know that you travel to a few different places. I may have a new project starting in Oregon. Do you know of anyone that would be qualified and be to be a winemaker on this new project? So the next thing I knew, I had an email from Pascal giving me Dominique Lafont's email and saying, you need to reach out to Dominique Lafont because regarding a potential new project in Oregon. So I did. Long story short, I ended up on a phone interview with Mark Tarlov in New York, And then, during that first phone interview, Mark invited me to fly over to New York for lunch. So that I could meet with with Dominique for one day. And it's a short flight. I flew from Buffalo, New York to New York City. But to me, that was amazing. I was parachuted into this whoa, what's going on? This little extraordinary thing of, okay, sure, I'll fly to New York for lunch. Sounds a little extravagant, but I'll do it. And sat down with Mark and Dominique. We discussed the Evening Land project, and a month later I was here. I arrived here in June of 2007. The lease on the vineyard, on the Seven Springs vineyard, so Evening Land was only one vineyard. Seven Springs, 65 acres of old vines, planted in the Eola Amity Hills. It's a beautiful site. So I was in charge of being here, but when I showed up in June, we had a vineyard that was being farmed by a vineyard management company. We had nothing else. So not even we didn't own a shovel or anything. So I had in 2 months had to find a winery space and suit it so that we could do harvest, et cetera, et cetera. So no small feat. It was challenging, to say the least. It was an interesting time for that summer. I ended up renting space in an existing winery, Laurel Ridge Winery, for the first harvest. I ended up as well, I anticipated, because we had so many tons from those 65 acres, it was, 120 to 150 ton project. As I rented space into the winery, I realized that I was the biggest client there, and that most likely the other people trying to make wine there would get upset with me, the amount of hours that I needed the sorting line for, or et cetera, et cetera. So I ended up finding a sorting line and a destemmer and a press for rent, brand new, from another new project that was not going to get started. They had purchased the equipment, but they weren't starting that year. So I rented the equipment, and the press I brought to Laurel Ridge to have my own press, to not compete with theirs. And their press was terrible anyway. It was terrible. It was an old Italian press And the sorting line I set up in the shed at Seven Springs Vineyard. I set up the sorting line and the destemmer in the shed at Seven Springs, undercover, rented a generator, got some electrical done, a diesel generator, so that we could sort and destem there and bring the fermenters to Laurel Ridge to be out of their way. That was how the first vintage was processed. And honestly, it was the best decision that I've made, because it ended up being a rainy harvest. And because it ended up being a rainy harvest, there was few and far between days that you actually could pick and process. So if I hadn't done that at the vineyard, at the winery, it would have been a total nightmare. A total nightmare. So it was interesting to work with Dominique as a consultant, so I could say he was my second mentor. Which was wonderful. He taught me many things, and when I first moved to Oregon, another little story that I can say is that the 65 acre at Seven Springs had 58 acres of Pinot Noir, 3 acres of Gamay, and 4 acres of Chardonnay. And I was super excited to see that there was 4 acres of Chardonnay at Seven Springs, and Dominique was not. and he was like, every time he would come and on his visits, we would taste all the Oregon Chardonnays around, and he would be a little bit like Pascal beforehand. The wines are just not good. I don't think this area can make good Chardonnays, Isabelle. And again, to me, it was like, I'm going to prove you wrong. We'll see what we can do. And it's been an interesting journey.
What did you think of Seven Springs Vineyard as you were getting to know it?
I thought I've never worked. So Seven Springs is quite different, meaning it was planted in 2 stages, and the old vines, the first 30 acres or so, were super wide, planted in the early 80s. You can drive your pickup truck between the rows. It was planted by a tree planter, so the rows are like not quite straight. So that was a little shocking to me. Having said that, the amount of vigor was also shocking to me. The soils here are a bit more fertile than what I was used to. So learning how to tame that vigor in the vineyard was important to make sure that we don't have leaves that are like dinner plates and green, and introduce some stress to the vines. The ease of the weather, meaning it rains in Oregon, but generally the summers are nice and dry. So your disease pressure is relatively low compared to other places. And ultimately, it was magical to have an established vineyard already. Something that was already 30 years old. There was some phylloxera issues, but having that established of a vineyard was really, really amazing and a wonderful start. I felt very blessed and very lucky to be able to work with that site.
You had talked about the importance to you of organic and biodynamic farming, and I'm guessing it was not that way when you took it over. So tell me about the transition then. Tell me about getting it up to where you want it to be.
So no, it was not that way when I took it over. And I asked, as soon as I started in 2007, I asked Mark, the owner, and I discussed with Dominique. Dominique was easily convinced because he already farms biodynamically in Burgundy. So I asked if we could convert the vineyard to organic and biodynamics, and got the okay, and we started the transition in the first year. And which was very exciting, and I could tell you that within about 3 years, you started seeing the fruit of the rewards, harvesting the fruit of your efforts. After about 3 years, by 2010, there was better balance overall in the vineyard, and there was also better acid balance in the must in the fruit that you harvested. And we started seeing that we needed to do much less adjustments inside the wineries because the fruit that would come into the wineries was more in balance. So it was very interesting. We never went. A lot of soil management and a lot of the soil management was not straightforward because the vineyard is diverse and you have different depths of topsoils. So some areas you need to have ground covers. Some areas it's better if you don't. So it was a bit complicated as far as the soil management can be because of the variety and what the diversity of the site. And learned a lot about phylloxera management because it was self-rooted, and there was some phylloxera lenses that we needed to try and rein in and not preserve those areas for the long term.
So tell me about the first wines then. You mentioned how the interesting process for the 2007 wines. Tell me about how they turned out and what you kind of took away as the potential of the project.
The first wines turned out very nice. I was a little shell-shocked when I came here because I discussed the fact that it was a wet harvest, the first harvest that I had. And I remember sometime in September, my husband was at Argyle, and then I remember people starting to pick what I would call a bit like panic picking because there's rain coming. And I was working with a local consultant, Steve Price, that's at ETS. And when I saw that, and I'd never worked here in Oregon, I never worked in the US, never made wine here, I called Steve Price with the weather forecast open on my computer. And I said, Steve, I see that people are starting to pick like significantly. And he says, yeah. And I said, because it says that they're picking because there's rain coming. And I said, I'm new here, Steve. Can you please let me know what that means? There's rain coming. Like, I can see the weather forecast, but can you try to make me understand what that means so that I can make the proper decisions. And he gave me the perfect answer. He was like, well, he says, you have a 10-day forecast. Here in Oregon, it changes too much. You can trust the next 3 days. That's going to happen. Over the next week, that's probably can change. He says, but what's in for the next 3 days is going to happen. And when it's going to rain, so you need to know that rain will happen, but if you see areas in between those events, it's maritime climate, it comes in waves like the ocean. When you see these will change and you need to work with it, sort of thing. So that's what I did, and it was a bit of a gamble relying on the weather forecast, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot that he was totally right. The first 3 days were the weather is pretty well forecasted, to the point where the weather can tell you it's going to start raining at 2 p.m. and you can schedule a pick that morning. Like, it was pretty reliable. The wines in the end were beautiful. I was a little shocked. I felt like our peers, some people in the industry, were talking too much about the rain and were just not singing the praise enough. I guess I came from an area where there's more challenges than that. So to me, that wasn't an issue. And I thought that the wines were beautiful, no matter what. We had good ripeness. They were beautiful. The Chardonnay, that's the one that I made a huge exception. And Dominique wasn't very happy with me because in my first year, because there was rain coming. I mean, I called Steve Price, there was rain coming. And the Chardonnay was right on the cusp. And so many examples of Chardonnay that I had tasted were a little too ripe to my taste. So I wanted to make sure that I captured that Chardonnay not overripe, with some good racy acidity, nice flavors. And I also wanted to, in my mind, reds bounce back from rain events better than white grapes. So I could not, where I felt it was okay for Pinot to withstand a rain event or two and dry, I didn't feel it was okay for Chardonnay. So I picked Dominique's consulting contract was that he comes once during harvest for 3 days. I ended up picking the Chardonnay 2 days before he arrived. In the first year. And when he arrived, we had just finished, I had not received my rented press yet, so we had just finished, me and my harvest intern were pressing Chardonnay till 4 a.m. because the press at that facility was terrible. It was a central bag that wouldn't inflate properly, and even though you would tell it to give you two bars of pressure, you would get to 1, and that was it, and it wouldn't do what you wanted it to do. Long story short, when Dominique arrived, and I'm just starting to work with him, he's my consultant. First thing he did is to go to the dump bin where the press had been dumped. He looks at what had been pressed and he's like, "You still have juice in this, Isabelle." "This is not well pressed." I'm like, "I know." We wanted to slather that bag. "I know it's not well pressed." He's like, "Yeah," and he says, the vineyards at Seven Springs, the Chardonnay, the vineyards, the old vines were on hanging trellis. They weren't even VSP. And when you're on a California sprawl, the cluster sits on top, and they're super exposed to the sun, more sun exposure than people want, especially on whites. So he was looking at and he's like, "Wait, it's neon green on the one side, and it's cooked by the sun on the other. Like, what's going on with this?" I'm like, "Sorry, there's nothing I can do. We need to put it upright. This is the trellising system at the vineyard that needs to be changed." But ultimately, when he walked inside and he tasted the juice at the tank, and I poured him a glass, he looked at it, he looked at me, he says, "Your juice is magnificent." I was like, "Wow, thank you." After all that. And that was it. And the first year, he kept telling me that he thought we were lucky that the Chardonnay tasted good. We had been lucky because he still wasn't convinced that we could do Chardonnay here. So, small steps.
It's amazing.
Small steps.
So tell me about the progress then of Evening Wine. You mentioned just getting started in 2007. How did it progress over the next couple of years, and what were your kind of the big moments for you, or the kind of the things you look back on fondly from those?
That's a great question. Thank you. The progress was that we rented space in the first year, and quickly, just to get us going. By the second year, we found a building that was being built to suit sort of thing, just an industrial type building, but very functional. So we built that in the second year and outfitted it with our own equipment, which made me feel a lot better in West Salem. By the fourth or fifth year, Evening Land was already, they had making a little bit of wine in California, and they had the Oregon winery. So we had a Santa Rita Hills winery, we had a winery in Oregon, and then over time, Mark Tarlov also wanted a winery in Burgundy. So Evening Land did that and acquired the 3 wineries. Over time, what I look fondly of, actually, is that by 2010, in California, the winery was in the Santa Rita Hills, but we had one vineyard on the Sonoma Coast called the Occidental Vineyard, and there was plans to get more fruit from the Sonoma Coast area. So I was asked if I could be responsible for the Sonoma Coast wines. And I had never worked there, so I thought that would be hugely interesting for me to be able to see the difference between the Seven Springs fruit and what I work with here and down there. So I accepted and basically ended up flying down to Santa Rosa once a month or so during the growing season to follow the vineyards that we were purchasing from there. I set up a AP facility in Santa Rosa, and my assistant winemaker at the time, whom was from down there, I asked her I said, during harvest, you can go make the reds down there and be close to home, sort of thing. And so I put her in charge of working there on a day-to-day. So I flew down and made all the picking decisions and worked on the protocols with her. The one thing that she didn't get to make down there is on the Chardonnay side, we picked it, we pressed it, and we brought it to Oregon as juice. And then we filled the barrels and fermented it in barrels at the Oregon facility because I wanted to be close to those barrel fermentations and things like that. So I look fondly of the experience I had in the Sonoma Coast. There was challenges with Evening Land because it grew too fast and it couldn't absorb everything that it was doing. But those successes for me, being able to work on the West Coast like this and see both sides was hugely interesting.
So you mentioned Evening Land growing fast. It was obviously a very ambitious project. So I'm curious, for you in your role, how did you sort of manage that ambition, and how did you sort of keep your role manageable as things were growing so quickly around you?
That's also a good question. In the beginning, it was a little bit difficult, but I was in charge of the Oregon project, and things grew in other areas that were not necessarily part of me. So I was able to manage the Oregon winery relatively independently. Having said that, we're not that big, but what I would call the corporate overhead kept changing, turning over. So I laugh that I've never worked with so many CEOs till the time that I worked for Evening Land, because I worked for 7 years at Evening Land and I probably worked with 6 different CEOs. It just kept changing and changing and changing. Same with the financial, same with whoever was in charge of the budgets and accounting kept flipping around. So that was interesting to constantly have a new boss sort of thing to run things through. And then at some point, from 13 in 2013, at some point the company was too much in debt and needed to rearrange itself. It could no longer sustain everything that it had done. There was millions of dollars in debt and all kinds of things. And so one of the parts at Evening Land too, as I mentioned the CEOs, but one of the good parts is also that starting in 2011, my current business partner with Lavinia, Greg Rolston, was hired as the CEO for Evening Land. He was based in Santa Rosa, and he had a long wine career, in particular at Chateau Montelena, and a little bit with Wilson Daniels, and ultimately he was hired to manage all the 3 wineries and to help with the Chateau de Bligny and Beaune, and he's the one that appointed me to the Sonoma Coast wines, which I found really interesting, and Greg and I had a great relationship, but the ownership of Evening Land was having trouble and wanted a huge reshuffle, and so that's when I left, and Greg left as well in early 2014, right around the same time.
So before we get on to your next project, I'm curious, in that time, how had you seen the wines develop and the vineyard develop? Like by the time you left Evening Land, how are the wines changed and how are the vineyards changed?
The wines defined themselves every year as we got to know the vineyard better. That's the part that I'm the most proud of. With that 65-acre vineyards, there's a few things that got. Then I planted 15 acres at Evening Land of new vines with some interesting clonal mix and other things, and the wines definitely got better and better with every vintage as we learned A, the site, B, as I learned the area and how to deal with the vintages. That's what's interesting here in Oregon, is the vintages are different, but you need to also adapt to each one. I was very proud of the results of what we made in the bottle. We had some amazing, scores and recognitions from those wines that I think are pretty extraordinary. And so that was the great side of things.
So as it came time to leave, did you have an idea what you wanted to do next?
As it came time to leave, I was I was very sad to leave Evening Land because I didn't want to. I had poured my heart and soul into that vineyard, into that project, and I felt very sad to say goodbye to that vineyard, especially with the new areas of plantings that I had designed and that I wouldn't get to work with anymore and see what happens to the fruit of my labor, sort of thing. But ultimately, it was necessary. So when I sat back, making the decision of leaving, when I sat back to try to figure out what's next, there was a couple of, headhunters called me asking me if I wanted to work here or there, or there was some positions available in Oregon too. So you have to start thinking as to what you want to do next. And I quickly realized that the one thing I didn't want to do was to become winemaker for an existing winery. Because I realized that I had put my heart and souls in what I had just created, and it had changed and it was pulled away, and I had to leave because it was changing, and therefore all those efforts went for nothing. So the desire to be in charge of my own destiny was super important. I was like, if I am doing to create something that I am very proud of, I need to be able to not have the rug pulled from under my feet, sort of thing, and be able to keep it. So it became very clear to me right away that I wasn't going to be a hired soul, that I needed to be my own boss, and that I needed to create my own thing, so that I could stay in charge of where it goes and see it go where I want to see it go. And that's what Lavinia came about.
So tell me about the sort of genesis of that idea of just deciding kind of the where and how that project would happen. Tell me and how it came and how you kind of got it off the ground.
So how I got it off the ground is some of it has to do with opportunities at the time, but how it got off the ground, a few things were certain to me. I wanted to stay in Oregon, so going to work on a new project somewhere else was of no interest. This is where our life is, and this is what I love, is the Oregon wines. The strong feeling that the Oregon wine industry needs to be brought up, continue to blossom, and I'm well invested in it, was super important. Because I'd worked with one vineyard site at Seven Springs predominantly throughout my 7 years there, I felt that I wanted to diversify that. I wanted a better understanding of the various aspects, but I also wanted to show people what the various aspects of the Oregon wine industry can be, of its vineyards. I felt that because Oregon is such a young area, quite often what makes people dream when you have a world-class wine region, it's its famous vineyards. It's the vineyards that people like, oh, it's Carlton Chardonnay, or oh my gosh, it's Romanée Conti, or oh wow, it's there's a few in California too, it's Hirsch, or it's whatever else. I didn't feel Oregon had that quite yet, and I felt that I wanted to explore quality vineyard sites, and I wanted to help make vineyards famous as a way to bring up the Oregon wine industry and on a world stage. So that's how Lavinia came about. As I was thinking about that, and as I was thinking how to do it, I was also thinking that as much as I'm well versed with, and I felt pretty confident with winemaking and viticulture, on the business side, I was not confident at all. So Greg and I were still in touch, and I would say that Greg Rolston became my third mentor in the wine industry. He was home-based in Santa Rosa, but like me, he had just left Evening Land. He had a strong pedigree on the marketing side, on the business side of things through his decades at Mount Helena and beyond. And we got along. So it felt natural, like he actually proposed it when I was, like we were talking, like, what do you want to do next? And I was explaining this. He was like, well, if you decide you want to partner up, I'd be in, I'd be keen on it. We can, and it felt like a perfect pair. Like, okay, now I will have a mentor to help me not screw up the business side of things, sort of, and learn. And at the same time, get to do, what we want and showcase some beautiful vineyards. And both of us are not rich, so we've grown organically, over the past 7 years, little by little by little. But the goal of, we've designed at its core, there's a few things we do that is not typical within an Oregon winery. First of all, we only make single vineyard wines. We don't make a Willamette Valley blend, or we don't make a super high-end reserve at the top. So we're not a pyramid like this. We're just here and showcasing these vineyards that have terroir, that have pedigree. That's one of the big. So our wines in the market are relatively line priced. They're all worth the same because they're all from different single vineyard. And the other thing that we do a little differently, and we had, initially it was financially difficult to achieve, but now I'm very happy to do that, is that we release on a Burgundian schedule, we don't release on an Oregon schedule, which means that we bottle our wines at 1.5 years, but we keep them in bottle for at least 6 months before we release them. We don't let the market make us release wines early. The wines are built to age well in the bottle, so we want to make sure that that we hold them and that we release them not too early, not too tight. That we want them to be beautiful and more together when they get released, more polished, more finished. So in the beginning, when you decide that you're going to take another 9 months before you start generating revenue, it's a big hit, but it pays after the fact, once you start in that.
So I really like the way you described the sort of vineyard and the vineyard, the need to kind of elevate vineyards. That's an interesting perspective that we haven't heard much before. And obviously there are well-known vineyards in Oregon, at least by Oregon standards, well-known. So I'm curious, as you went looking, what were you looking for in vineyard sites that you thought would have the terroir you wanted? And how did you go about sort of securing and getting to know those vineyards?
Good question. Before I answer that, you made a comment that I feel is super important. There are some well-known vineyards within Oregon. But if I go to the New York market and I launch with my distributor and I'm in a room full of sales rep and I ask them to name me 5 Oregon vineyards, they can't. They don't know. Locally, we know them, but it hasn't yet been there, which now, but with regards to how to select these vineyards, there was a few things, there was a few important things, and we continue on that path today. It was important vine age. So we don't work with anything that's less than 25 years old. So the vineyard has had to be planted at least by, at least by the mid-995 or 2000 at the minimum. Anything newer plantings than that does not, in my mind, have the established rooting system in order to showcase yet the attributes of the vineyard. Obviously, there are some of my preferences with regards to soil types and exposures. Of course, not a drop-dead scenario, but in order to, because stylistically I like more elegant wines, we tend to favor eastern slopes or southern slopes, never a west slope. More on the eastern side, morning sun as opposed to afternoon sun. I prefer jories or volcanic type soils over the marine sedimentary, so I tend to be more keen on those sites. But with each site that we selected, there needed to be something unique or a certain je ne sais quoi type thing that made us be like, oh, this will be distinctive. One of them that we worked with for years called Lazy River in Yamhill, Carlton. The je ne sais quoi was the fact that that AVA doesn't really have jory soils, but that vineyard was all jory. And in an AVA that's known for its marine sedimentary soil, to have a jory soil site felt very unique, and that was super interesting. There is Tualatin Estate up north, was planted in the early 70s. It's on its own roots, but it's so secluded that it doesn't have any phylloxera yet, and it has laurel wood soils, which are pretty unique in their own rights, and I wanted to learn about that soil type and work with it. The other part of the vineyard selection that was super important is the partnership with the owners. Like I mentioned, like we're not rich, we've grown organically, and we wanted great relationships with our growers and the vineyard owners, the owners of these vineyards, so that each site that we secure fruit from, there is the ability to grow within the sites. Like, okay, these are the blocks that we choose to start with, and then we have the opportunity to grow at your vineyard with you, and you obviously will be willing and able and happy to do that with us, sort of thing. The other part of that was important in the vineyard is that at each site that we work with, we source from more than one block. So even if we don't buy a lot, even if we just buy 6 tons, there needs to be at least a few areas for those 6 tons, because it's not a terroir-driven wine if you source from one block and you end up putting 777 on the 3309 from this area in the bottle. Then it's a single clone. No, it is what it is. So anything that we favored mixed clone blocks if they existed, or at a minimum from each site, I tend to favor blocks that complement one another. The cold section of the vineyard and the warm section of the vineyard that you can put together. In that way, you get the true sense of the entire vineyard, not just what the southeast corner can do in that vineyard.
So on that note, I'm curious. You talked about your mentor kind of poo-pooing the idea that Oregon had the terroir. What have been your observations of Oregon's terroir and especially the places you've worked with?
I think that I think that we're still very young, and I think that Oregon's terroir, I think, has a lot to give. I think we're still learning how to best showcase it, and that's what has shaped the last 2 decades, is us fine-tuning on how we can best showcase and to some degree make better decisions about how we plant and what we plant and how. It's interesting because I've given you the couple of stories of the things that from my previous mentors, that I was like, okay, I'm going to prove you wrong. I'm going to prove you wrong. I can tell you that Dominique Lafont now completely believes in Oregon Chardonnay. Absolutely. He just knows that you have to farm it different than Pinot. He just knows that if you follow some specific guidelines that he's used to, the results can be amazing. One of the upside of that is at some point there was an event in London in the UK that another famous Burgundian winemaker attended, and the evening land wines were poured. And it was, I'll say the name, Christophe Roumier. Christophe Roumier came to the evening land table to taste my Pinot Noir. And it was poured in his glass, he smelled it, he looked at Mark Tarlov, he smelled it again, swirled it, he looked at Mark Tarlov, he says, wow, you can make wine like this in Oregon? And that is why I make wine.
To prove people wrong.
But also the best reward is when people are tasting our wines and they go, wow.
Wow.
It's not the score, it's not whatever. It's the best rewards that I've ever had is when people look at me and they go, wow, that's amazing. That really make an impression on me. If you can create memories and memorable wines to people, it doesn't matter if it's a Christophe Roumier or if it's just someone that is walking down the street. No matter who it is, making those impressions is the key to me.
So tell me about the growth of Lavinia. You mentioned obviously the business marketing, not something you were terribly familiar with or excited about. So tell me about how it has grown as a business and obviously the space we're in now and kind of what Lavinia looks like to you now of 7 years in.
Yeah, Lavinia started very small. We made 1,200 cases in our first vintage. We sourced from 5 different vineyards, i.e. 5 different AVAs, approximately 250 cases from each. It's very small. We haven't grown a ton, but we are definitely growing. There's been some hurdles in the last couple of years too.
You don't say.
Yeah, I don't say. But I think when we started, and I think every business plan that you make is always going to be subject to change as you make it. When we started, we wanted obviously a strong direct-to-consumer program. Turns out, some of the challenges of not owning your own winery and making wine in someone else's space is that you cannot be a host quite as easily. So by default, we set up more distribution than we anticipated in many markets. We are now we are distributed in 15 markets. We are exported in 5 different countries. So Canada in particular. So that part in the beginning was like now we're just starting the DTC program, the direct-to-consumer program. And it's super important, and it will. And now this is driving our growth. So we started with 1,200 cases in our first year. We are now at 3,000 cases, and we want to grow by next year to about 4,000 cases. Having said that, now we have the other challenge that it's more and more difficult to find fruit. I mean, there's a huge demand for fruit right now, in part because of outside investments, in part because of some of the weather events that we've had, and everyone not making enough wine and everyone wanting to make more. So it's definitely a seller's market. But the goal is definitely to continue the exploration of terroir and to find these sites that are distinctive and interesting and unusual, and to teach people what they can be and hopefully help put these places on the map.
So in that growth, then tell me about how the past couple of years have gone. Obviously, 2020 was a challenge in so many ways. So tell me about that hurdle for you. What were the sort of decisions and challenges you had to make in 2020, or had to deal with in 2020, and how did you come out the other side?
With the pandemic specifically, in 2020, we had to. By then, we were 80% distributed. So our wine sales were 80% through the distributor channels and on and off premise, and only 20% was direct to consumer. Obviously, the distribution stopped completely with all the restaurants shutting down and everything. But our DTC, even though it was only online, because we did not have a space or a tasting room. Oh, nobody went to tasting room anyway. Even though it was online, our DTC started building. So it made sense after the 1 year of the pandemic. And so we had actually started looking for a space for a tasting room back in 2019. It just takes a long time to find the right place, the right size, in the right location, etc., etc. So we had started casually looking for a tasting room that we can call our own. And then the pandemic pushed that need further. And we were super happy to get this space last fall, in the fall of 2021, finally. And now I can say that because of it, the shift, we're less reliant on distribution, and our sales, our DTC, are much more prevalent.
And what about harvest of 2020?
Harvest of 2020. We should all forget it. No, I don't mean to be so doomed. Harvest of 2020, I had never dealt with any type of smoke. I mean, I've dealt with frost in my past. I've dealt with hail. I've dealt with all kinds of Mother Nature challenges. Smoke was not one of them. Spring frost or autumn freeze or whatever. So it was foreign to me, but I knew it was bad. And the beauty of, I would say, kudos to my business partner, Greg. I mean, he spent most of his life in Santa Rosa on the Sonoma coast. He was much better versed in potential of smoke taint and the adverse effect of what smoke taint can be than anyone up here was. And I remember I was a little shocked because when I was talking to him as the events were unfolding in September of 2020, he was telling me on the phone, he was like, if this lasts for more than 48 hours, forget it. Like, you're done. Like, if you have this amount of this thickness of smoke, forget it. After more than 48 hours, he says, we can do bucket ferments, we can test for smoke taint, but it's there. Like, it will be there. Just know that. And so, long story short, we did not produce any wine in 2020. We skipped the vintage, and with our grower partners, we had several discussions with each one of them as to how to ride this wave together. So we didn't necessarily leave them lurching or hanging, but we certainly had these discussions as to, okay, do you have crop insurance? How can we make this work? And in some cases, we split the cost of the viticulture 50-50, so that we both took the hit if they didn't have crop insurance, things like that. But we skipped the harvest, which in the beginning, I thought like, whoa, this is a big deal. Like, you always think as a winemaker, I can probably make that work. in retrospect, I'm very happy we did that. Yeah, it was probably cutting our losses was the best decision.
Was there anything that you did during, in kind of in lieu of making wine, was there anything you did with the grapes to kind of prepare for the next time it happens, if it happens again, or do you feel any better prepared?
I feel better prepared because I took a crash course in what smoke taint can be, learned to taste it with other people's wines and other things like that, learned to discern it, learn what the thresholds are. And if it happens again, I think it has to be, again, this sort of partnership between wineries and growers where you share what happens with Mother Nature. And I was discussing with someone, like, there are things like, what do you do in a grape contract? Like, what sort of clause to include to protect all parties from smoke taint? And some contracts are like bucket ferments and analysis, etc. And I was suggesting to someone, I said, honestly, everyone should just look at the air quality index. And once you have that threshold of air quality index within the valley, for air quality index plus time equals, okay, now we need to renegotiate. Okay, now we need to take these steps. So I feel better prepared for the future. I'm knocking on wood that it doesn't happen often here. Hadn't happened significantly to the point where it was a problem for our harvest in the past. So hopefully we have a good reprieve and we don't get this issue often. But it's terrible. I mean, but the partnerships are the most important thing, I think.
So what comes next for Lavinia and what comes next for you?
Great question. Lavinia will continue to build and promote the best side of Oregon that we can showcase. That's definitely a goal. I want to continue to help the Oregon wine industry and make sure that it is recognized on the world stage as a quality area. Sustainability, I think a lot about how to make sure that we're kind to our planet and we farm sustainably and we don't become a monoculture like you see in other areas, and keeping the diversity. So those are the things that are on my mind as to how to move forward. And also the opportunities that, okay, the climate is changing, how do we change with it in a good way?
So you talked earlier about your sort of kind of pre-impressions of Oregon wine from the wines you'd had before you'd been here. So tell me about, since you've been here to now, what are the changes in Oregon wine? How has it changed in those years, and what does the industry look like in 2022?
In 2022, the industry is in a great spot. I think it has come forward leaps and bounds in the last 15 years that I have been here, both in terms of focusing with its varietals and focusing on its techniques and on the quality that it can bring in the bottle. There's been some subtle shifts in varietals as well, and other shifts that will continue, I think. And 2022 Oregon wines are, to me, much consistent and much better than they were 20 years ago. And I think that will continue. The industry shares a lot. The industry is very communicative, and we are a true team, and we talk about our winemaking techniques and other things through our technical panels in order to make sure that we continue to improve. And I think we're most of the way there. We just need to get the rest of the world to see it.
You talked about other varietals, and obviously you mentioned an interest in Chardonnay that kind of predates Oregon's interest with Chardonnay. So tell me how Chardonnay has changed since you've been here, and what Oregon Chardonnay specifically is looking like right now.
Chardonnay has been, what's changed a lot is that when I came to Oregon, no one wanted Chardonnay. Not even the owners of my winery. I was a huge champion because I love making whites. It challenges me in different ways than reds, and I think that Chardonnay is one of the things that I really enjoy. And it's been wonderful to see how other wineries have fine-tuned and how the plantable acreage people are now into it. They're planting it, they are making it, they are refining their Chardonnay style, and it's much more accessible. And it's, from an industry perspective, it is, everyone's on board. Now it's about getting the consumer on board. That's the part that, making sure that Oregon Chardonnay becomes a category is important, because there are some wonderful wines and coming out of it. And as a matter of fact, it's in demand now. It's hard to, I was concerned when I saw the craze of Chardonnay plantings 10 years ago that it would collapse, but it has not. People now, it's difficult to find Chardonnay fruit, which means we need even more. So that's wonderful.
And what comes next for the Oregon wine industry? What does it look like? What will it look like in the future?
I would like to see the Oregon wine industry to continue to be the camaraderie that it has, to continue to be wonderful hosts to everyone that comes. And with that, I would like to see a bit more infrastructure to help us be great hosts. And a bit of a destination. And once that's done, I think the industry will continue to refine itself and find. I would like to see different trials on different varietals that we can plant other than Chardonnay and Pinot, so that we're less of a one-trick pony and we can offer a little bit more diversity. That's what I would like to see, especially in terms of now seeing the warming of the climate and other things.
And you talked a bit about what's next for Lavinia. Is there anything else on deck for you specifically? Anything else that you want to do, projects you're looking into, experiments you want to try?
I look forward to have a vineyard site so that I can go crazy with the planting of it. That's the next step. When I can afford a piece of land and plant it, it would be wonderful. That's probably a first step, would be developing a vineyard in out-of-the-box ways that I have in my head, that I would like to put on paper, on the land, not just in my head. The next thing, hopefully, is build a legacy. We have a son that's becoming a teenager. If I can get him to love the industry, not that he has to, but if at some point he gets interested, and we can have establishing a legacy, whether it's with my son or any other way, is also important and on the docket.
All right. That's all the questions that I have for you. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover here that you'd like to cover?
I think this was a very complete interview. Thank you so much. I mean, now I need a sip of water.
Well, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your stories and your hospitality and your new awesome space here. We appreciate it, and we'll let you off the hook.
Thank you.
Thank you.